Geologists, glaciologists and material scientists have long recognized that minerals in deformed polycrystalline aggregates develop their characteristic grain shapes and textures as a result of solid-state processes. These involve plastic flow to accommodate the deformation. The objective of this video is to present a brief synopsis of the flow processes believed to be important in the deformation of some polycrystalline aggregates. We shall treat in detail only those structures due to plastic flow that are resolvable using a petrographic microscope. Your attention will be focused to the processes of recrystallization, particularly those involving grain boundary migration, as we are currently witnessing in this film of a progressive simple shear in a polycrystalline ice aggregate. We will also consider the origin of slip bands and the anisotropic deformation of minerals, together with the relationship of slip bands to kinks and the ultimate fabrics that develop in a polycrystalline aggregate. Polycrystalline ice will be used in the following set of experiments. These experiments represent two-dimensional models of a material with one slip system. Ice is hexagonal, and in common with many hexagonal and pseudo-hexagonal minerals, undergoes translation glide on crystallographically controlled planes. In ice, the dominant glide plane is parallel to the basal plane, which occurs between the puckered hexagonal rings of oxygen ions in red. The glide can occur either parallel to the shuffle set of oxygen ions, S, or the glide set, G. The C-axis, or 0001 crystallographic axis, is perpendicular to the glide planes. To undertake the deformation, samples of polycrystalline ice measuring approximately 40 by 20 millimeters and less than 1 millimeter thick will be deformed in either pure shear or simple shear, in a temperature range between -10 and -1 degrees Celsius. The load in all experiments is along a vertical diagonal, so that in a pure shear experiment, the shortening direction, indicated by an arrow, is directed vertically downwards parallel to epsilon, whereas the extension direction and plane of flattening is horizontal. An area equivalent in size to the view that you will observe in any sequence of events is shown in red. This represents a real distance of approximately 10 millimeters across the screen, unless indicated otherwise. In pure shear, the principal axes of the strain ellipsoid, X and Z, parallel the extension and shortening directions respectively. They do not undergo rotation. In a simple shear deformation, the sample undergoes a rotational strain, and the principal axes, X and Z, of the strain ellipsoid progressively change position, as does the plane of flattening. If we take three differently oriented individual grains and shorten these under a condition of pure shear, we see that in the initial blue and brown grains, there is the development of distinct slip bands. Superimposed on the yellow grain at higher strains are poorly defined slip bands and a prominent kink band. The original starting material has basal planes with orientations as indicated by the dip and strike symbols. The basal planes in both the blue and the adjacent orange grain are favorably oriented for easy glide once deformation begins. The yellow grain is in an orientation for hard glide. After the sample has been subjected to a pure shear involving a shortening of 2%, The blue and brown grains exhibit the development of slip bands, which are produced as a result of glide on their basal planes. Accompanying the glide, there is also minor grain boundary adjustments. The blue and brown grains are also the first grains to undergo an obvious change in crystallographic orientation. This can be seen in the marked change of their birefringence colours to the yellow-green colour observable at higher strains. The basal plane in the yellow grain is lying in an orientation unfavourable for easy glide. Consequently, it accommodates the superimposed strain by first undergoing lattice bending that ultimately develops into kink bands. Within any aggregate, grains with an orientation similar to the yellow grain are unstable and may be reduced in size through adjustments of the boundary between neighbouring grains. Such grain boundary adjustments are generally prominent in zones of high strain concentrations such as kink bands. We will now look at the behaviour of another three grains deformed in a pure shear environment, where the overall polycrystalline aggregate will be shortened 30%. The deformation histories of these three grains have been recorded using time-lapse photography, that is, one image every 5 minutes, over a period of 5 days. In these three grains, we can see that the same processes are occurring, but under dynamic conditions. These processes are further complicated with grain nucleation and grain growth occurring on the boundaries between neighbouring grains. As a result, the original grains are reduced in size and are preserved as relics or algin between the unstrained new grains. Within the algin, the old grain may retain its slip bands or preserve deformation features such as undulose extinction produced as a result of buckling of the glide planes. The buckling always occurs after glide or shear has been initiated parallel to the basal plane and is associated with the development of undulose extinction. The position of the bend axis within an individual grain will depend on the constraint exerted by the neighbouring grains, which are also undergoing geometrical changes as a result of the deformation. With slip continuing on the basal planes, zones of gentle lattice bending known as deformation bands may develop. These may become sites for the propagation of kink bands. Kink bands have sharply defined kink band boundaries, across which there are major orientation changes that are produced as a result of local yielding of the material. The location of the initial bend axis need not correspond to the location of the kink band. In fact, the positioning of the kink band will also depend on what is happening in neighbouring grains and along grain boundaries, and hence is capable of moving through a given grain. In other words, the kink band may be unstable. In the following experiment, we are going to take a thin platelet of ice from a single crystal, which also contains a few small air bubbles. The orientation of the plate is with the basal plane parallel to its surface. Hence, the c-axis is pointing out of the screen. This single crystal will be deformed in a dextral simple shear environment at -10 degrees Celsius over a period of 5 days. Strain is first localized to produce a set of kink bands that have a rapid lengthwise propagation. This produces a local rotation of the crystal lattice across the kink band boundaries, followed by a period of relatively passive behavior. Bulk strains accumulated during the passive behavior probably leads to the sudden nucleation and growth of new and short kink bands oblique to the first ones. Where rotation across the kink band is locked as a result of its curvature, the kink band becomes a site for new grain nucleation. Eventually, elongate relics of the single crystal, easily identifiable by their crystallographic orientation, are left as algin between the recrystallized grains. At the same time, different algin have undergone small rotations, as seen in the change of their birefringence colors. If we look at some individual stages in the sequence of events we have just witnessed, we will see that the first detected kink bands can be produced at shear strains as small as 0.05. The first detected recrystallization in the locked kink bands also begins at very small values of shear strain. This recrystallization preferentially overgrows the kink band, with a major proportion of the single crystal being replaced by a recrystallized grain aggregate, again at relatively small values of shear strain. In fact, kink bands are often well-defined structures in strongly anisotropic materials. For instance, if we deform this large sample of layered ice in a pure shear configuration, we are deforming a sample with two grain populations. The smaller, birefringent grains have a random distribution of z-axes, as seen by the black dots on the accompanying stereographic net. The elongate, green and dark grains have subhorizontal z-axes, as seen by the concentration of red dots. Hence, the elongate grains have their basal planes, which are the glide planes, oriented parallel to the direction of shortening. After this sample has been subjected to the shortenings of 3, 10 and 19%, we see that deformation in the elongate grains is accommodated by bending of the basal planes to form kink bands. Once a kink band has been initiated, there is little change in the orientation of the kink band boundary with respect to the shortening axis. In the strongly anisotropic grains, the subhorizontal kink bands are stable features that do not move through the crystal, but instead act as small shear zones. The initially smaller and randomly oriented grains have been reduced in grain size and now lie as small elongate recrystallized grains between the subhorizontal kink band boundaries. We can summarize these changes in the next series of diagrams. Deformation is first marked by gliding on the basal plane, and it undergoes elastic bending during the propagation of the kink band. Further deformation is then confined to the kink band, such that beta, the angle of obliquity of the basal plane with respect to the kink band boundary, is reduced in value. This occurs by shortening across the width of the kink band. The shortening across the kink band is accommodated in part by slip on the basal plane within the kink band. At higher strains, this becomes geometrically difficult, and the strain is accommodated by propagating new kink band boundaries, or secondary kinks, as seen in stage 3. The newly formed secondary kinks generally have planar kink band boundaries, whereas earlier kink band boundaries, such as the subhorizontal kink band seen in the center of the screen, may be irregular. These irregularities are due to the bulging and migration of the boundaries. Grain nucleation and growth, as seen in the grains marked with the crosses, also preferentially occurs in the kink band. These new grains are initially strain-free and are properly nucleated as part of a strain softening process. This allows the kink band to accommodate continued shortening. In some situations, instead of nucleating new grains, the shortening is accommodated by propagating small microfractures longitudinally across the kink band boundary into the rotated limb of the kink. These microfractures emanate from pre-existing slip bands and can be recognized by the presence of small irregular steps truncating the slip bands. In such situations, grains outside the kink band can remain completely unfractured, even at very high strains. These microfractures are generated in order to prevent the formation of voids during the rotation of the basal plane. This dilatation problem is also overcome by the nucleation and growth as a solid-state process of new recrystallized grains. If we now consider the deformation that occurs in a polycrystalline aggregate, which begins with more or less equant grains, we will notice that many of the processes we have just described, such as intracrystalline glide, kinking, and recrystallization, are dominant. Adjacent grains in the initial aggregate have a random distribution of their c-axes when plotted together on the lower hemisphere of a stereographic net. In the pure shear deformation that follows, the sample will be shortened 30% over a period of 5 days. We see here the undeformed sample. The onset of deformation under the vertically directed load begins as intracrystalline glide on the basal plane. You can see that the slip bands that are developing are differently oriented in adjacent grains. As deformation proceeds, the slip bands are bent, and this produces undulose extinction and differences in the birefringence colors. To accommodate the strain, some grains develop distinct kink bands. It should be noted that these do not appear in every grain. By now, you have probably become aware that contemporaneous with the movement on glide planes and the development of kink bands, there is also dynamic recrystallization. That is, processes involving grain nucleation and grain growth. These are particularly obvious along grain boundaries and in kink band boundaries. Recrystallization reduces the original average grain size of the aggregate, leaving a few relict old grains as algons. An example of such an unstable old grain, or algon, is the green grain on the left-hand side of the screen. In general, the new recrystallized grains are nucleated as small equiax grains, and grain boundaries then begin to bulge and migrate as they undergo grain growth. These new grains are themselves deformed with the continuing deformation. As a result of the competition between grain growth and deformation, the grains become aligned. In this pure shear deformation, this produces a subhorizontal foliation defined by an alignment of grain shapes. At the same time, many old grains displaying higher order birefringence colors have disappeared, and this reflects a marked change in the c-axis pattern of preferred orientation within the sample. What we have witnessed in this pure shear deformation is a rapid transition from randomly oriented c-axes of the initial ice aggregate to a small circle distribution containing 2 concentrations of c-axes. These concentrations are symmetrically related to the shortening axis and the plane of flattening defined by the grain shape distribution. In all the pure shear experiments, we have the situation where the principal axes of the strain ellipsoid do not rotate. The plane of flattening in the corresponding strain ellipsoid will coincide with the alignment of grain shapes and the fabric development defined by the c-axis distribution. This is symmetrically related to the shortening direction in the sample. The geometrical configuration in pure shear is in marked contrast to the situation we are now going to see develop in 2 simple shear experiments. Both involve dextral movement superimposed on a polycrystalline aggregate. The grains will appear to move progressively upwards as grains are displaced in the direction parallel to the boundaries of the shear zone. Starting with this undeformed grain aggregate, the deformation begins with glide in suitably oriented grains. Initially, glide is the dominant intracrystalline deformation mechanism. Glide within individual grains is not uniform, as suggested by the formation of undulose extinction and the subsequent development of kinks. Rotation is also occurring, both within individual grains and between neighbouring grains. This is further complicated by contemporaneous recrystallization. The nucleation of small equiaxed grains occurs along grain boundaries and on sites of pre-existing kink band boundaries. These are concentrated in zones that are oriented oblique to the direction of shear. The boundaries of these zones are defined by an alignment of Augen. The alignment of Augen and the zonal distribution of the new recrystallized grains corresponds to a deformation-induced foliation that is being progressively rotated towards the direction of shear. This last experiment has been undertaken at -10 degrees Celsius over 5.5 days, whereas the next experiment will be undertaken at -1 degree Celsius for 6 days. The first change is the development of serrated grain boundary margins and the disappearance of some of the smaller grains. This occurs by migration of the original grain boundaries contemporaneous with the development of slip bands in the larger grains, and particularly those favoured for easy glide. The slip band development can be best seen in the blue grains in the centre of the screen. Nucleation of small new equiaxed grains appears at very small values of shear strain. The distribution of recrystallization nuclei is irregular, but is in part controlled by pre-existing grain boundaries. The equiax microstructure is preserved only as long as the new grain boundary migration is unimportant. If migrating boundaries are pinned, then the equiax shape of the new grains is rapidly destroyed, with the development of serrated boundaries producing an interlocking grain structure and further grain refinement. Again, there is the development of a grain shape alignment, oriented in a northwest-southeast direction, and an obvious crystallographic orientation. The predominance of the green and blue colours in the sample suggests that the crystallographic preferred orientation is quite strong. If we compare the -10 degree experiment with the higher temperature -1 degree Celsius experiment, it is noticeable that the grain boundary migration and nucleation tends to start earlier in the -1 degree experiment. Grain nucleation in the colder -10 degree experiment is principally confined to grain boundary sites, with the new grain size being appreciably smaller than the original grain diameter. In the higher temperature experiments, that is -1 degree, nucleation of equiax grains was followed by rapid and extensive grain boundary migration, with the occasional independent grain undergoing coalescence with neighbours to form larger grains. Although the intracrystalline processes are essentially similar, it is clear that temperature is a fundamental parameter controlling the final texture, whereas both temperature and the magnitude of the shear strain governs the distribution of recrystallized grains versus Augen within a sample. If we consider the C-axis patterns developed in these simple shear experiments, there is a marked change. The undeformed sample had a random fabric of C-axes when plotted on the lower hemisphere of an equal area stereographic projection, whereas the distribution of C-axes in the deformed sample at a shear strain of approximately 1 is a strong single maximum oblique to the direction of flow, and to the observed alignment of grain shapes indicated by the dashed line. It should be noted that in the center of the stereographic projection from the deformed sample there are few C-axes. Most cluster along the borders in a northeast-southwest quadrant. The peripheral concentration of C-axes suggests that grains in a high glide orientation have been eliminated during deformation. We have seen that the removal of such grains has been by processes involving dynamic recrystallization and grain boundary migration. The C-axis fabrics observed here are consistent with the C-axis fabrics measured in natural ice. They are also comparable with crystallographic fabrics recognized in other mineral aggregates, particularly those that have undergone simple shear where one glide plane is dominant, as in the case of quartz. It should also be noted that the single maximum pattern developed in simple shear is in marked contrast to the double maximum pattern that we saw developing in pure shear. The rapid development of strong C-axis fabrics can be related to reorientation of grains for easy slip and continued dynamic recrystallization. Although the two crystallographic patterns of orientation are different, in both cases they have developed through the same solid-state dynamic processes of glide, kink band formation, and recrystallization. In fact, the differences in the crystallographic patterns can be attributed to the fundamental differences in the kinematic movement patterns that characterize the shape transformation undergone in a pure shear versus a simple shear. Overall, what we have observed is that dynamic recrystallization in a grain aggregate is a strain softening process that may locally partition strain throughout the sample. For example, the yellow grain at the top left side of the screen has its C-axis projecting outwards towards us. It is in a hard glide position for the pure shear deformation at -5 degrees Celsius that it is about to experience, whereas the blue grain is in an easy glide position. What we now observe in this deformation, filmed over 4 days, is extensive recrystallization in the yellow grain and predominantly glide on the basal plane in the blue grain. Although the processes of recrystallization and glide may appear to be competing with one another, they are all contributing to the plastic flow and the ultimate fabric developed in any aggregate of grains. In these dynamic sequences, we have also seen that temperature during the deformation is a major control on grain size and governs the rate of grain boundary migration. If the sample is annealed after deformation, that is, subjected to a sudden rise of temperature from -5 to -1 degrees, then this enhances the mobility of the grain boundaries. The temperature rise we will now see occurs over a period of 2 hours and will be maintained at -1 degree for 5 hours. Pre-existing grains in the deformed aggregate act as nuclei and grain boundaries sweep rapidly through the grain aggregate. These replace the smaller deformed grains with large undeformed grains with smooth boundaries, equant grain shapes, and with boundaries meeting at triple junctions. Therefore, from this video, it can be seen that when interpreting a grain microstructure or texture in natural materials, we must be aware that there are many competing processes and physical variables.